All right, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Welcome to West Shore Community College's Humankind series. Humankind is West Shore's arts and culture lecture series. It includes lectures, talks, presentations, but also workshops, performing arts events, art exhibitions, and much, much more. We are recording tonight's event and it will be available on the college's website sometime soon. Each year, Humankind focuses on a different theme or topic, and this year's focus is the future of work. We are asking the question, what is the future of work? And we don't presume to know the answer. This theme is part of an international conversation happening right now about the future of work post-COVID and includes topics like remote work, the 4-day work week, quiet quitting, and tonight's topic, the Great Resignation. Tonight, we are so excited and so very honored to have economist and author Dana Peterson speaking with us. Dana Peterson is the chief economist and center leader of economy, strategy, and finance at the Conference Board in New York City. She previously worked as an economist for Citi and the Federal Reserve Board. Peterson's research has been featured in US and international news outlets, both in print publications and broadcast programs, including CNBC, Fox Business, CNN, Yahoo Finance, TD Ameritrade, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, among many others. She received an undergraduate degree in economics from Wesleyan University and a master's degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dana's presentation tonight is entitled, I Quit, The Great Resignation and the Future of Labor Markets. We're really looking forward to it, and we thank her for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dana. Our format tonight is that Dana will speak for approximately 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box you see at the bottom of your screen. So use the Q&A rather than the chat. And Dana has graciously said that she will accept questions even during her presentation if you have a question about one of her slides. All right, Dana, the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for having me. I'm going to talk through some slides. Again, if there's anything that's confusing, don't feel shy about putting it in the chat and asking a question, but we'll definitely have Q&A later. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this large screen. Yes? Okay, awesome. So I quit, the Great Resignation and the Future of Labor Markets. So basically, there's just some big mega trends here in terms of what's going on. US workers are quitting. They quit during the pandemic. They're quitting now in the face of a possible recession. But let's talk about why people are quitting. The underlying reason is due to labor shortages. What's causing these labor shortages? And what's the future of the labor market in terms of whether people are going to stop quitting? So we're going to talk about those things today. So we run a number of surveys of CEOs, and back in November-ish, November, December, we asked CEOs, what are you the most worried about? And the top 3 things were economic downturn or recession, inflation, and labor shortages, right? So they're very worried about these 3 things. And in terms of, those were external existential threats. In terms of internal threats, they said, well, big things that matter to us are driving revenue and profit. You can glue those together, but also attracting and retaining talent, right? So they're very much focused on the fact that they can't find people to work, and they also need to keep people working for them. So why is everybody quitting? Well, I mean, first of all, it seems like everybody is quitting. If we take a look at these lines on the chart, you can see that the rate of people quitting, which is the black line, really spiked during the pandemic. I'm sorry, after the worst of the pandemic, and it's still really high. I mean, fewer people are quitting now, but we're still well above the level that we were back here in 2019. And one reason why lots of people are quitting is there are lots of job openings, and that's the blue line. That's really spiked, and it's still pretty elevated. So that means people have choices. Whereas maybe back here between the great financial crisis, which is this bar right here, and the pandemic, people didn't have as many choices. In fact, we had a very long recovery in the labor market after the great financial crisis, after the Great Recession. So right now you have plenty of jobs, so lots of folks are quitting. And when we ask ourselves, well, where are people quitting? It's kind of mixed. Definitely in leisure and hospitality. So that's hotels and restaurants. And also in retail trade, that's come off somewhat, but still people are quitting. And then people are definitely quitting in healthcare and in transportation, warehousing, and utilities. So, transportation and warehousing, you can think of like Amazon or UPS. And so a lot of these jobs pay very little money. So that's a big reason why people are leaving, because there are other jobs and other opportunities out there, and they're seeking those opportunities in other industries. Now, quitting has come off a little bit in some of the sectors that I call the pandemic darlings. So the pandemic darlings were industries that did very well during the recession. So during the pandemic. So the tech sector, everybody was forced at home, and so they bought computers and all the services and things that go with computers. Lots of people started streaming. Lots of people started playing with video games. And so all that requires technology. And so the tech sector was really hot, and a lot of the tech sectors in the quote unquote information industry. Also, the financial sector was a pandemic darling because lots of people started playing the stock market, becoming day traders. And whenever interest rates fall, that's generally good for the financial market. Also, construction did very well because when interest rates fell, mortgage rates fell off, and lots of people went out and bought homes. And so you had to build new homes. Now, some of that action is coming off now that interest rates have risen pretty rapidly, and the housing market is slowing down, so there's just fewer opportunities out there, and so fewer people are quitting. You could see with information, a lot of it's tech that's really come off, right? And we're seeing a little bit of that coming off in financial services. But just going back to this, you still see a lot of quitting, especially among those very low wage jobs. So, why do quitters quit? Well, it turns out that you do win. Quitters win in this economy. And this is a measure of wage growth. So, usually people who switch jobs tend to make more money than people who stay in a job. And you can see throughout history that there's a gap. But that gap really widened out over the last year and a half or so. So people who left their jobs and switched are making significantly more money relative to the people who stayed. And that gap, you can see, has really gotten pretty wide. It seems like we're kind of plateauing here, but the gap isn't getting smaller. So more opportunities in terms of different jobs, more opportunities in terms of higher paying jobs. And if we take a look at where wages are rising the fastest, so I just indexed this back to October 2020, when wages really start to pick up, you can see a lot of the wage growth is in services, right? And so it's really, so leisure and hospitality, that's hotels and restaurants, but also health services. These are all things that require people to physically go to work. And many people don't want to do these jobs. And so businesses are raising wages to try to get people to come and work for them. And also they're raising benefits and giving people promotions to get people to stay. And so that's why you see wage growth being very aggressive in those industries where you have the most quitting. So where do these another issue is labor shortages. And that labor shortages are the greatest, again, in those occupations where there's a lot of quitting, and also where you have to physically show up to work, right? So healthcare, you have to show up if you're a nurse or you're a doctor. If you're in business and professional services, A lot of these folks are people who may be admins or janitors, and they have to physically show up to work. Accommodation and food services, again, hotels and restaurants, you have to show up to work. Retail, again, if it's brick and mortar, you have to show up. Manufacturing, you have to show up at the factory. Now, you see some other things here like state and local government. A lot of that's because state and local government jobs are usually jobs that, um, well, can't really increase wages. And so if somebody retires, it's very hard to get someone to replace them. So that's what's going on here. But for many of these other jobs, you really have to be there on the ground. But you can see that for information, there's really not much demand, right? Because the tech sector shedding jobs because they were a pandemic darling. Same thing with construction, right? But really the big labor shortages are here. And again, that goes back to the fact that many of these are low wage jobs where you have to physically show up to work and people are opting out. They're moving to other sectors. So, what's kind of a laundry list of things that are driving these labor shortages? Well, during the pandemic, you had all the things above the line were very much associated with the pandemic itself. People were afraid to go out because they might get sick and they might die. Many people had pre-existing conditions. There were travel bans um, in and out of the country and even around the country. Many people built up their savings because of the stimulus checks that they received. And then some people didn't want to work because of vaccine mandates. So that's all in the past. But right now, you still have a lot of things that are keeping people out of the labor market. So, one thing is, a big thing is many people retired, right? And we have excess retirements, meaning many people retired earlier than they would have due to the pandemic or because their assets appreciated during the pandemic because their homes became more valuable or their 401ks became more valuable. So they said, you know what, this is a good time to get out and get out of the labor market. But even if that didn't happen, many baby boomers are retiring. And you can kind of see that in this chart on the right-hand side. So this is basically dividing the number of people who are working age, so anybody who's between 25 and 64, over the number of people who are retired, so people over 65. So the way to understand this chart is back in 1980, you had 4 working people for every retired person. Even in the early 2000s, you still had around 4 people. But then look what happened up until now. Now you have 3 people, right? And then 10 years from now, you're going to have 2 people, right? So these are all the baby boomers leaving the labor market. And this is new. We've never had anything like this before, where you have big chunks of people who are just exiting. But you still also have many people who are disabled or sick with long COVID. You have many parents who have challenges finding childcare or finding care for their elders. You have many people who don't have the types of skills that are needed, so skills mismatches. As I mentioned, low wages, so people are saying, I'm going to get out of those jobs where I'm not getting a lot of money and I have to show up to work. I don't have the option to work from home. Also, many companies have really tight job requirements. For example, making everyone have a college degree. There's nothing wrong with college, but some jobs you don't necessarily need it, right? But if you were using that as a way to restrict the number of applicants, some companies are saying, well, maybe we'll stop doing that. Instead, maybe we'll just let anyone in and then train them to do the job. And then we have very strict immigration policies, and that's been true over the last 2 administrations. And then you have few people who want to hold multiple jobs. And all of these things are contributing to labor shortages and the Great Resignation, people quitting. So let's take a look at some pictures here to illustrate what was in the previous chart. So we have a lot of missing workers. So basically, if we looked at the labor force participation rate, which is essentially the total number of people who are employed and unemployed divided by the civilian population, I'm sorry, the civilian labor force, you can see that we were doing okay before the pandemic. And in fact, you had many more working age people coming into the labor market, which is the navy blue line. Then the pandemic happened. And so this collapsed. We're still trying to recover from the pandemic, meaning getting back to the 2019 level up here. So you still have a lot of people who are working age who are just not there, but we're getting closer and closer. But if you look at the number or the percentage of people who are 55 and older, it collapsed and it hasn't really recovered. It's just kind of moving around, moving sideways. And again, this is happening because of some of the things that I mentioned in the previous chart. So you have fewer people who are working multiple jobs. So you can see that there's still a pretty big gap of about 500,000 people who are just working one job. Why? Because they can quit and go get a job that's going to pay all the bills. So you don't need to work 2 and 3 jobs. You've had a lot of excess retirements. So what does that mean again? So this gray line is the trend. So this is how many people you would expect to retire. And for much of the last 15 or so years, the blue line has tracked what you'd expect. But then bam, you see the pandemic happens in here and a ton of people retired. So this is roughly 2 million people in here who have left the labor market faster and sooner than what was expected. And then I mentioned childcare and elder care. So why is that a problem? Well, you just don't have the workers. So you can see there's a gap of about 75,000 missing childcare workers. And again, it's a job that tends to pay low wages. You have to physically show up. It can be dangerous, it can be dirty, it can be all those things. Same thing with nursing care. So nursing care is this light blue line, and that collapsed during the pandemic, and it's struggling to get back there. So many people are not working because they have to take care of children or take care of elders. And then, unfortunately, a lot of people perished. Roughly 1 million people died from COVID that we know about, that we have on record. And approximately 270,000 of them, which are these navy blue bars, were working age, right? So people between, roughly 18 and 65. A lot of these people perished, especially this group, this older group. And so they're never coming back, unfortunately. And then when we think about migration, this last value here is just an estimate of what net immigration was for 2022. We don't have the actual number, but you can see that we kind of reached a peak back in 2016 and it was coming down up to the pandemic, and then it collapsed during the pandemic, and we don't know where we are if we recovered. Now there is data on H-1B visas issuance, and the issuance has returned to 2017 levels. So that's great. So maybe we had some improvement in immigration immigration for your high-end, very highly skilled workers. But still in all, when you look at immigration statistics for unskilled workers, it's still very, very low. So we're missing immigrants, roughly anywhere from 2 to 3 million immigrants. We don't have relative to where we were, what we could have had if we continued this trajectory upward from 2016. So what are companies thinking about? So again, we have another survey of CEOs, one that we conduct once per quarter, and that's in partnership with the Business Council. So the Business Council is like the Business Roundtable. It's the same group of people. They're all CEOs of big Fortune 500 companies. And we ask them once a quarter, what are you thinking? So most of them think that there's going to be a recession, right? 85% of them think it's going to be brief and shallow. 13% think it's going to be pretty bad. So add those two together, that's what is that, 98% expect a recession. So usually when you have a recession, companies say, well, we're going to cut workers. But then when we ask them, what are you going to do about um, your your hiring? Many of them still think they're going to have difficulty finding really high quality people, right? Not as many as, say, a couple of quarters ago, where many of them said we're going to have trouble, but still you have a good percentage that do. What is this? This is roughly, that's 54 plus, so that's 57% still think they're going to have trouble finding workers. So even though there could be a recession in the US and a lot of CEOs are expecting there is going to be one, we don't think the unemployment rate's going to spike. In fact, here's our forecast. So we're right here is about 3.4%. And so we think we're probably going to get to around 4.5%. And that's super low. How many jobs is that? Unfortunately, it's roughly 900,000 layoffs. I don't want to be in that number. Nobody does. But that's certainly better than what happened during the recession when the unemployment rate jumped to 13.5%. And even during the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009, the unemployment rate jumped to 10%. So it was here. And we're just going to get here. And why is that? Again, because of labor shortages. Many businesses are saying, look, we can't find workers. So why would we let people go if we think there's going to be a short recession and it's not going to be so bad, right? And also you have entire industries that are still trying to hire people. Again, those industries that are low paying, that are inconvenient. So the big question is, well, if we are going to have a recession, are labor shortages here to stay? Are people going to continue to quit? Well, we think labor shortages and quitting is going to be with us forever unless we have some really big policy changes. And so when we look out over the next decade, you're going to have labor shortages, especially in those types of jobs that you have to physically show up. They're manual labor, they're labor intensive, and you may not necessarily need a college degree. So folks in those groups actually have a lot of opportunity, right? Because there's going to be shortages in those jobs that tend to require people to physically show up to work and do manual labor. So here's a bunch of industries where you can see the risk. So if it's red, that means you're at a high risk for a labor shortage. If it's blue, very low risk, and you can see the percentages for a bunch of different types of jobs. And healthcare ranks number one, right? In terms of there's going to be very high demand for it. You don't really need a lot of education necessarily, but it's not very flexible, right? You can't really work from home for a lot of healthcare jobs, right? And then also things like installation, maintenance, and repair. So the average age of people who do like electrical plumbing and construction is in the 50s. They're in their 50s. And so we need more young people, but there may not be enough young people to go into these trades. But you can see like things like sales, and we're always going to need people for restaurants and things. But even here, we're seeing automation. How many people have gone to a restaurant and no one takes your order? You're just handed an iPad, or you're given a QR code and you have to get on the phone and order your own food, right? So automation is going to make some of these jobs um, more easily um, disappear, but some of these other jobs you still have to have, right? And so you're going to need people, and there may not be enough people in the US. And here we just have the distribution for healthcare, all different kinds of jobs. So we're always going to have dentists, need dental assistants, but all these other folks have a very high risk in terms of labor shortages. So this is opportunity for young people, but it's a problem for the US if we can't find enough people to work these jobs. And especially we've done, quite a bit of work on immigration. many people who are immigrants, who are unskilled, tend to go into a lot of these jobs that, are manual labor jobs. But if we're limiting access, then we're going to be stuck with labor shortages. And here's, a distribution for STEM. It's not as bad, right, in terms of potential labor shortages, but even some of these jobs are going to be automated away. And even now with things like AI and Chat GPT and 3D printing, um, some jobs that used to be high end, like researchers and book writers, may even become obsolete. So I'm a little worried about my job as an economist, but but certainly technological advancements are going to cause the death of certain industries and certain jobs. So in the short run, what are companies doing about labor shortages? Well, they're throwing money at the problem because, again, even though many of these executives think a recession's coming, they don't want to let go of their workers. They're hoarding workers. And how are they doing that? Well, they're raising wages. So we asked them, how much, well, rather, how many of you expect to raise wages over the next 12 months? And then by how much? And you have an extraordinary number that will raise wages by 3% or more. So those are those blue bars, right? So that's still really astounding, even facing down a potential recession. And again, it goes back to those labor shortages. And we also asked companies, well, what are you doing to address, um, I'm sorry, what are you doing to address the fact that you have labor shortages? And again, they're increasing wages across the board. Some of them are reducing hiring and including hiring freezes, but the first thing they're doing again is throwing money at the problem. And in another survey, we asked CEOs, what are some of the things that you're doing in terms of human capital? And you can see that a lot of it has to do with developing their workforce, training, right? And also strengthening their cultures to make people want to stay at a particular job, right? So happy workers means they'll stay. And some of that has to do with wages, but a lot of it also has to do with um, capability, training, upskilling, and also promotions and career pathing. So I think this is my last slide. After I've depressed everybody, there is some hope in terms of how do we deal with quitting and the labor shortages that are underpinning the quitting. Well, like I said, a lot of companies are throwing money at it in the short run, right? They're raising wages, offering benefits, but this isn't really sustainable, right? Because you can only raise wages but so much before it becomes untenable for a company. And guess what? These companies are basically passing along higher wages to consumers, and that's driving inflation higher. So these things aren't really sustainable, as I said. But more companies are offering remote work where it makes sense, because flexibility is a big issue that many workers desire. And so if you can work from home a couple of days a week, or 1 day a week or something like that, then that's a bargain. And certainly remote work is great for businesses where they can choose workers who may be working in a lower cost jurisdiction. But there's also going to be outsourcing. Many companies are looking outside of the US, and remote work actually facilitates some of that. But then there's also money being thrown at paid benefits like paid leave or subsidized childcare. I mean, honestly, the US is way behind the rest of the world, the developed world, in offering these things. But a lot of companies are also looking at automation. So, for example, if you go to your local supermarket, there are more self-checkout lanes, right? You go to like I mentioned, you go to a restaurant and there's only one person to bring out the food, and no one's actively serving you because they can't find the workers. And even when we talk to some tech firms that are letting people go, they're opting for automation, machines to do things. but also things that are a little less, necessarily disruptive. Many businesses are offering flexible hours and work arrangements which include remote work. They're training their workers. They're advertising higher wages and benefits, or they're doing one-off bonuses, things that are a little less, that are a little more sustainable, rather. They're also lowering education and skills requirements. So, for example, you don't need a college degree for every single job. So that opens up the door for more people to come in. Also, some companies are looking at bringing in marginalized and unconventional workers. So, who are these folks? So, oftentimes people who are disabled. Remote work is kind of like, a blessing for them because they don't have to commute. They can work from home, and manage and be able to contribute even though they're disabled. And unconventional workers are folks who, often are formerly incarcerated. They may have a mild record, and basically they're shut out of labor markets. And so many businesses are considering people with mild records, where it makes sense to bring in those folks. Also, recognition and incentives, promoting people without raising their salary or giving them more responsibilities or moving them around the company are also things that are happening. And then finally, job sharing, which, definitely works when you have jobs where you have to physically come into the office. But a lot of these things are really just band-aids. And we definitely need policy changes. So, sensible immigration policy. This is an international, global slide. So, higher birth rates doesn't necessarily work in the US. So, in China, they're trying that out. But certainly encouraging later retirement. But that requires changes in laws and regulations that don't punish people for working later, right? Or don't punish people for, if they are retired, getting a job. But also licensing reform, right? So if you're a plumber, so I live in New Jersey and work in New York City, they're right next to each other. In some cases, your licensing only allows you to work in one state, which makes no sense. It's like plumbing isn't significantly different from New York to New Jersey, right? So we need that kind of reform. And oftentimes that's at the state and local government level. And then certainly the disability designation reform. Oftentimes when people are declared disabled, they're shut out of the workforce. And so all of these things are really big policy issues, that can address labor shortages, not only in the short run, but over the long run. But again, if these things don't happen, then you're going to continue to have labor shortages and people are going to continue to quit. So I'll stop here and we can ask questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was outstanding. It was so informative. And like, the best presentations, it raised many questions, and we already have a couple questions actually. And for our audience tonight, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Here's the first question. Is there also a societal change in our paradigm of real success, i.e. living a more natural and minimalist life? Are people finally seeing that owning more stuff isn't worth the time and effort of working themselves to death?
I think there are definitely generational beliefs about work. I don't want to pigeonhole any particular generation, but certainly you have some themes that run across or within generations. So, for example, I'm Generation X, right? We were raised by our baby boomer parents, and we were told, look, if you work really hard, you'll be successful. So what do? We work ourselves really hard. Look at me. I'm actually still in the office. Like there's nobody here. So, but I wanted to do this event. But even on like a regular day, I might still be here, right? So you're told to work yourself to death, and then you do that and you realize, well, it's not about like how hard you work but who you know. Right. And then you have the millennial generation and Gen Z who have different things that are of value. And certainly for the millennials, they lived through the Great Recession, which was the worst recession we'd had since the Great Depression. And so for many of them, they graduated from high school and college, and there were no jobs. And there were no jobs for 5, 10 years. And that really delayed their ability. Oh, and by the way, they had massive student loans. So that delayed their ability to achieve, quote unquote, the American dream, a house with a white picket fence and all these things. So it's like, well, having things, I can't acquire that, but I can have experiences. And so experiences became very important where people would splurge on a big vacation or get Groupon and do all sorts of things. And so, I think that, the Great Recession fundamentally changed that group's way of thinking about the accumulation of wealth and things. Now, millennials, the first set are now all in their the oldest ones are now in their early 40s, and now they have families and children. They're like, well, actually, I kind of do want to buy a house. So during the pandemic, we saw a surge in people who were 35 to 45 buying homes, right? Because people were like, okay, pandemic happened. I'm living in this tiny little apartment with five other people, or, we have two kids, one bedroom apartment. We're going crazy. Let's move to the burbs, or let's move to a lower cost city. So even though a lot of their dreams were delayed, now they're starting to fulfill them. Now with Gen Z, their biggest fears, millennials, their biggest fear was environmental apocalypse. For Gen Z, their biggest fear is being murdered in a school shooting, right? But they're also very concerned about the environment and sustainability. So that changes the types of products that they buy and the way they experience things. So, they're into thrifting, right? Use clothes, use items because that's more sustainable, right? So I think, each generation is influenced by, whatever's going on um, in existentially for them, whatever they're experiencing, that influences their desires for buying things or enjoying services and the like. So that was a really long answer.
No, it's a great answer. That's very helpful. Another question here. In your surveys, employers indicated they are not going to lay off employees and they will increase wages. Is that a positive indicator for a shallow recession, you think?
I think it certainly can contribute to a shallow recession because if you think about what gets you to a recession, you basically need households and consumers to stop buying stuff, right? And to stop going to the movies and stop buying cars and that sort of thing. But if people continue to be supported by higher wages, that offsets the inflation, all the price increases we're seeing for like food and energy and rents and housing, then people will still think about consuming things. So as long as people have money coming in and they're not afraid that they're going to lose their job, they're going to continue to spend. That's just how Americans work. The US people in the US operate. So, I mean, a lot of people are hearing about layoffs, but the layoffs have been really concentrated among those pandemic darlings that I mentioned. And a lot of them are actually in the higher end of the income spectrum, like people in finance and people in tech. And, for a lot of those people, we're not even seeing the layoffs in the data because they get severance packages, right? So they don't go and apply for unemployment because they're still technically employed by the company, even though they're not showing up for work every day or logging in. Certainly, if consumers continue to spend, then there won't be a recession. We'll have a quote unquote soft landing where the Fed is able to bring down inflation without causing a recession.
Okay. Another audience member wants to know if you can address what quiet quitting is from your perspective, maybe from the economist perspective.
Sure. So, I mean, people have always quiet quit. I just think, people kind of put a name on it. And my understanding is it's basically people having a different perspective on life. And that's a function of the pandemic itself. So the pandemic hit, people were told businesses shut down, stores shut down, people were told to go home and do everything from home. And then people realized, wow, I was spending 3 hours a day commuting. I can instead spend that time hanging out in my backyard or with my children or taking up some hobby like cycling or whatever, right? And people really assessed what was important. Do I want to work myself to death or do I want to have some balance between work and life? And some people say, the balance is worth more than the money. So that's another reason why a lot of people are quitting and they don't want to join certain industries. It's like, well, I do want to work from home sometimes. I don't want to have to commute 3 hours every day. And so, and some people say to themselves, well, I don't really want to work really, really hard for a company and do all this extra stuff and not get compensated, right? So I think there's always been some measure of quiet quitting, but someone gave it a name. And I think that, just that whole facet of thoughts around work and work ethic was really magnified during the pandemic and post pandemic.
So you see quiet quitting almost as part of the Great Resignation, or they're sort of two sides of the same coin, so to speak?
I think it can lead to the great resignation, um, especially if you find yourself, well, I mean, if you figured out a way to do enough work to stay employed and your employer is happy with that and you're happy with that, then maybe you won't quit. You'll stay where you are. Maybe the benefits are great, you know, maybe they're not. But if you're really unhappy, it's like, well, I can jump to go find another job because, hey, there are like 10 openings for the same job where before the pandemic there was only one or zero, right? So I think that there are different things. But certainly, people looking for that balance in their lives might cause them to quit one job to go find another job that allows for balance.
Okay. Another question here, as a community, what do we do to attract young people to come to our area and retain the young people we currently have? We face an aging workforce in our businesses and industry.
Yeah, that's a tough question. And when you look at the census data from 2010 to 2020, you had massive migration. Where did people go? They left the Northeast, they left Michigan, they left California, they left New York, and they moved down, they moved to southern states and, you know, inward, right? To places like Texas or Tennessee or Florida, right? And so a lot of that had to do with people looking for places that either they didn't have to pay as much taxes, right? Or they retired and they want to be in a warmer climate, or maybe the cost of living is lower. Um, and then certainly during the pandemic, people were looking for places where they can get more space, a bigger house for less money. And so that made a lot of these cities in the South and the West more attractive. And so you've had a massive demographic shift over the last decade, and that was increased or magnified during the pandemic. So it's really hard to turn that around. The key thing is, can people find jobs? And if people can't find jobs and if they can't afford to live close to where that job is, then it's very difficult to keep young people, right? So, and that's a big challenge for cities like New York, where um, the cost of living is just so high. It's ridiculous. I mean, New York is exciting, it's fun, it's an international city, so you still get young people coming, but you still have a lot of families who left, right? Because they needed space and it was unaffordable, all those things. So it's not an easy answer. So the key thing is some of it's policy related, where there need to be policies that attract business, and consequently attract people.
Here's another question. Jobs with the highest levels of loss are low education and low flexibility. But where do you think are those employees going? Are they reskilling to more flexible jobs that require more education, or are they leaving the workforce entirely?
It's a mix. So, some jobs, think about, transportation workers. Many of them are older. They're in their 50s and they're retiring and, they're being replaced by machines. So they're not coming back and there's no job for them to come back to. Um, you do have what can you repeat the question again? That was just one aspect of the answer.
Yeah, jobs with the highest levels of loss are low education and low flexibility. But
Right.
where do you think those employees are going? Are they reskilling to more flexible jobs that require more education, or are they leaving the workforce entirely?
Okay, so some are leaving the workforce entirely because they're retiring. Others are going to other industries. And note that some of the other industries are lowering the requirements and they're saying, look, come work for us, we'll train you. Right? You don't need the college degree or master's or whatever it is. Just come and we'll figure it out. We're that desperate. And so, and also, we'll let you work remotely, 2, 3 times a week. So that's where people are going.
And the person who asked about quiet quitting earlier is asking, does quiet quitting lead to actual quitting? Is quiet quitting a gateway to to actual quitting?
It can be if someone is just really disgruntled. Well, there are two different types of quiet quitting, right? There's the people who are just like, I think who are, just unhappy with their jobs. And so they do the bare minimum and they'll stay where they are because they're comfortable and they're allowed to do that, right? And then you have the people who are looking for balance, right? And if they don't find that balance where they are, then they may actually quit.
Another question here. The pandemic was and is a horrible thing, but it did drag us kicking and screaming into the working remotely world. Do you think we will see remarkable shifts into rural areas if we can supply adequate internet broadband?
Yes, we've already seen, certainly during the worst of the pandemic, a lot of people did move to suburbs, exurbs, and rural areas. Um, and that's been disruptive because they kind of bring their big city ways with them, and they, but the thing is that, yeah, I mean, there's a lack of reliable broadband in the poorest areas of the country and in rural areas, which may not necessarily be poor, but they're just rural and difficult to put in infrastructure. So um, that if the infrastructure is there, then you may have even more people moving to rural areas. But the solution can't necessarily be laying a bunch of lines across big expanses. It may be some of it satellite driven, right? Or you build local hubs and things like that. So yes, I mean, where the technology facilitates, yes, you're going to have more people potentially moving to rural areas. They can get more space, have a different style of living, maybe a less costly cost of living.
One of our attendees wants to know if there are parts of the US labor market that are more subsidized by the US government than others,
Um, Subsidized meaning,
maybe supported by the US government, financially or otherwise.
well, there actually are going to be more sectors that are going to be supported, and that's due to something called industrial policies. What are industrial policies? Essentially, when the government tells companies where they can put their factories and their supply chains. And we're seeing that happen now. So, for example, with the last two big pieces of legislation out of the current administration, the the IRA and the other one, the infrastructure, whatever. I don't remember the names, but essentially embedded in them is money that's going to go to sectors that are devoted to R&D, technology, and the energy transition. right, away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. So there are going to be some really, there's going to be a mix of industries and companies, some of them which aren't, poor or small, that will be, provided money and underpinnings to advance that agenda, because essentially we are in sort of a technology race and infrastructure race, war with China, right? We see China as a strategic competitor, and China's building up its R&D and its infrastructure and all advancing energy transition, and so the US is saying, well, we need to do those things too, to you know compete with them.
Mm.
So it's going to be, certainly, construction, uh, you know tech firms, anything that's creating pharmaceuticals or new types of 3D printing, or even infrastructure, companies that are going to be building out um, battery charging stations, or building, you know, EVs, and trucks and vehicles and all those kinds of things. There's money out there, and if it's not direct dollars, it's tax cuts and rebates and those kinds of things that
Mm.
are savings for a company.
And to our audience tonight, we still have time for more questions. You can put your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. While we're waiting for some more questions, Dana, I'll ask a question. I hear a lot of my students and a lot of people locally say no one wants to work anymore. And I wonder, what does an economist say about that? I noticed that was not one of your reasons listed for the reduction in employees. I wonder, what does an economist say about that idea that no one wants to work anymore?
Um, I I mean, if you don't work, you don't eat, right? So, I mean, a lot of people, in fact, a lot of people are working, right? When we look at the unemployment rate, it's 3.4%. So that means 96.6 people are at work, some kind of job, right? So I think it's more, um, the thought about productivity and how much people want to work at the jobs they're at. Um, and like I said, there are different attitudes, and some of it may be generational, some of it may be personal, um, but I don't really believe, at least statistically, that people don't want to work, because you have tons of people who are working.
Yeah. Another question. So when we look at an industry like leisure and hospitality, we've seen a lot of people quit. And as you pointed out, wages have gone up in those industries. Do you think that will lead to a permanent transformation of those industries for the better? Better jobs, more fulfilling jobs, better paying jobs. Will that be permanent in some industries, like leisure and hospitality?
I think, some of it may be yes. And indeed, when we think about wages, um, wages is compensation is a share of GDP. So if you add up everybody's wages and benefits, all the dollars across everyone who works, and divide it by GDP, that share has collapsed over the last 40 years, right? And now all of a sudden we've seen it pick up a little bit during the pandemic, but it's still really low. Why is that? Because companies prioritize, um, dividends and stock buybacks, and the investor over the worker, right? And that's just, it's that's what happened. So whenever companies accrued more money, and revenues, and made profits, it went to the investor, because the investor owned the company. Now companies are more, uh, concerned about multiple stakeholders, right? So it's not just the investor. They actually do have to care about their workers, because if your worker's unhappy, he or she or they, them will leave, right? So you have to make sure they're happy. And you also have to care about what your customers think. If your customers think that, your products are not environmentally sound, and they don't want to buy whatever you're selling, that's a problem, right? And a lot of companies also have to think about how society looks at them, what's their activity in the community. So it's called stakeholder capitalism, as opposed to just focusing on generating returns for the investor. Um, so um, I think that just, distilling that all that down, I think that it is going to be beneficial for the worker because suddenly companies realize, well, we do need to pay people, right? May not be paying them a livable wage, especially at the lower end, but $7, 7.50 an hour is just it's just not going to cut it, right? Um, I mean, it creates a lot of angst for companies because that's a cost, right? Because they still have the investor. And usually companies don't make changes unless the investor says, okay, you need to focus on these other areas. And more investors are starting to do that. Um, but certainly when you're not a public company and you're a private company, it's difficult. It's like, well, how much revenue sharing is there? But if people are going to walk out the door, then we need to do this. So I think that there's going to be some permanency, um, and I think that fundamentally work has changed in terms of remote work being there. But there's also automation. There's like the stick and the carrot, right? So the stick is, you know, I'm sorry, the carrot is we'll offer remote work, we'll be more flexible, you'll have a higher wage. But the stick is like, well, if you don't do what we want, we'll automate you, which we saw, right? I'm not going to name any names in terms of companies, but turn on the news. So I think you know, there's going to be some equilibrium, and I think it's going to be a little bit higher, but it may not be back to where we were, 30, 40 years ago, where essentially, um, the worker was gaining more from the profit sharing. And part of that is because you have fewer unions and more people have to kind of negotiate on their own behalf. And the beauty of the Great Resignation is that you have a whole group of people essentially deciding to negotiate for themselves all at the same time. So it's kind of like this unofficial union.
So will the increase in wages, I mean, will that improve Americans' quality of life greatly, or is it not that significant?
Well, it can, if you don't have inflation. And that's the problem. While wages have been rising over the last year and a half, so is inflation. So it's just eroding whatever gains you may have had. And that's one thing is that, wages have been rising almost at the same clip as inflation. So that means, with every extra 50 cents or a dollar you have to pay for that good or service, you might have gotten an extra dollar from your job, right? Because you quit and you found a higher paying job, or your boss was scared you're going to leave, so they gave you a bonus or gave you an increase in your salary. So you're able to match that, right? But if it but there are consequences to wages continuing to rise and people having this potential spending power and them going out and spending. That creates a lot of demand, and if there isn't supply, right, enough supply, prices go up. So you have to have a delicate balance there.
One last question for you here, Dana. We're almost at time here. An audience member wants to know, do you think the Great Resignation will lead to greater union involvement, union engagement? Will we see more unions, more union contracts, that kind of thing?
I mean, we are seeing a little bit of that, but um, it's going to be hard because a lot of um, unions are difficult to form, and a lot of times companies try to beat them back with threats like, well, we're going to automate your job, we'll bring in the machines, and that'll be the end of your union and you. So um, we have seen a pickup in unionization, but I don't think it's necessarily going to get anywhere close to what we saw, back in the 60s and 70s when unions, and even the 80s where unions were in, their heyday.
All right. Thank you, Dana, so much for being here with us tonight. Really appreciate it. It was very informative. Thank you for all your time. To the audience, thank you for being here. If you could, when you log out of this presentation, you will see a survey, and if you could please fill that out, we greatly appreciate it. That helps us in our programming for the future. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.